essential Israeli position is that there can be no theoretical possible basis for Iran to be able to have a nuclear weapon.
That's right.
There, as a peace group, let me say, I think that Brooklyn for Peace agrees, broadly stated, with the idea that no country should be having nuclear weapons. They are bad things, and we would like them to go away. That, of course, includes our country, Israel, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and the other nuclear powers. I mean, we think this across the board. So, we do know that this is the goal of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is a goal I think that all of us really do share. With that said, the fact is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows for, quote, the peaceful, unquote, use of atomic energy, whatever that may really be. And Iran, obviously, as a signatory to that treaty, is entitled to its own peaceful use of nuclear power, however misguided that may in fact be. The fact of the matter is, of course, that the treaty regime has made compatible this idea of you can be nuclear weapons ready with the idea of not having nuclear weapons. And that counts as nuclear disarmament. And I do think I think we all agree it's going to be a difficult proposition to say that Iran should be treated just like any other country that has a nuclear capacity in this regard. We're going to have a very difficult time given the interests of AIPAC, and it's our job as a peace organization to try to mobilize as much as we can in order to deal with that problem. And I think as Rusty indicated, part of the reason we're here tonight is that we are in a different period of time because we now have an administration that, however hesitantly and however, what should I say, diffidently, they are nevertheless pursuing a policy with Iran of actual diplomatic engagement. This is something that we've been calling for as a peace organization for a very long time. And it's something that we want to support. We need to do it on the most informed and best possible basis.
Another central point of Israel is to beat the drums of Iran so as to distract most of the world, especially the United States, from the Israel-Palestine issues. And they've done that more or less successfully in Congress, but they haven't done it more or less successfully in the rest of the world. And part of the reason for that is that there are other factors that are weakening Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis Iran and AIPAC. And one of those factors is the international boycott movement against Israel until it withdraws from the occupied territories and so on, and gives equal rights to Palestinians in Israel. And this has been it's making headlines every day. Netanyahu no longer walks on water because of his frustration over his inability to just yell anti-Semitism every time another country or another organization votes to boycott Israel until it gives human rights to the Palestinians. And that has to be viewed as a factor. And it is. It's a growing mass movement. It's a factor that's affecting this whole equation. And the more successful it is, it seems to me, the more successful our battle vis-a-vis Iran will be, because Israel's influence within this country and the world will be less.
There is an issue there in terms of what Naomi is talking about, in terms of what we want to emphasize. And what it is that we think will actually make change. My own feeling is that in terms of the United States, not other countries, but in terms of the United States, to this point, there has been no movement by the administration or by Congress to do anything decent on the Israel-Palestine question. And that we've had a situation in which for however long, the administration just props up Israel, period. And I actually don't think BDS is having the slightest effect on that piece. It may have other effects that are positive and important. I don't know, Denver, but in terms of U.S. policy, I don't think it's doing anything. And I think that's something that we need to really address. You know, here is really our government's role supporting Israel, members of Congress supporting Israel and everything that it does. Because Netanyahu thinks it's in his interest. And part of what I'm suggesting is that as we fight back on the Iran issue, we should be broadening it. You know, and we should, in fact, use this as an opportunity to fight back against these organizations that have locked up our elected officials all this time. And I think that's something that's really very much worth doing, and we haven't done enough of it.
I think going back to the Israeli position, you know, how if they would want to sabotage this, they're not going to bring out the issue of conflict between U.S. interests and Israeli interests. Obviously, that's not a line to pursue with American policy. But what the argument you can see coming up is technicalities.
Right.
Looking at various technicalities, saying, well, you know, the Iranians are hoodwinking the administration, they can do this and that. This is why, in talking to congressmen, you have to be precise what exactly is it they don't like. And here you find that actually here the administration is pretty solid ground. They know what they're doing. So you have critics saying, well, Iran is plutonium. Okay, the word plutonium already makes people nervous, you know. Why do they don't mention that the limited plutonium is actually for medical purposes, and you can't use that plutonium for weaponizing. But congressmen are quite frequently repeat what the think tanks say about these issues. So the devil's often in the details we have to know when we deal with congressmen about it.
Yeah, so taking, Rusty, what you were saying, to broaden the issue, it seems to me that one way of broadening it and going on the offensive against AIPAC and not just fighting defensively is to raise the issue of Israel's nuclear weapons, right? And to put out, you know, make that at some point, make that a lead issue. Why are you supporting Israel's, you know, nuclear weapons and not allowing Iran? And you know, put it that way to see if we could force them to be on the defensive and back them up a bit.
Well, I agree with that. Although, again, I also, you know, think, you know, the position is so, the position that people like Schumer have taken is so ridiculous. You know, it's so absurd. It's so clearly not in our national interest. I really do feel like we have to hammer him on that. But I also agree that it's appropriate to link it to the question of why it is, you know, that our position is a nuclear-free Middle East, right? I mean, that's, and that's not okay for Israel to have an arsenal at the same time as we're, you know, pressing the Iranians to not even build one weapon, you know, without a risk of war.
One thing I wanted to kind of get at a little bit in this conversation is, you know, the discussion about national interests, American interests, Israeli interests, whatnot. I feel like one of the missing links in this discussion is whose interest are you talking about when you're talking about national interests?
Yes.
The interest of working people, or the interest of, say, the multinational corporations that are based in X or Y country in particular. So I'm uncomfortable with talking about American interests if we're not clear that we're talking about the interest of working people in particular, or the people in general. One of the interests that we have as a peace group is that it tends to be the sons and daughters of working families that go to war. A war, it's against the interest of the Iranians to have to go to war, the Iranian people, and the same thing for Israeli people. So I do feel that we need to stress that on some level when we're talking to Congress people. The other thing is that I feel very strongly that we are in a unique position here in Brooklyn, because not only is Schumer our neighbor, he is the senator for all of New York State, but we're right in his front yard, both here in Brooklyn and in the city at large. He is basically throwing a monkey wrench into the process of diplomacy and giving diplomacy a chance, which what our leaflet says, give diplomacy a chance. I think that's a perfectly good position for us to be taking. And I think that we need to press our temporary advantage. I do believe, I think I agree with Rusty that this thing could turn around very quickly. Nobody's mentioned the role of the mass media. They really ginned up opposition, and suddenly all the Congress people were voting the AIPAC way just last summer. We see that people at the grassroots can make a difference if we really get out there and make our presence felt, make phone calls, write letters, are in the streets, all the different things that we need to do. I think we need to dramatically express our opposition to the role that Schumer's been playing. I would even go so far as to say that we should offer him the Monkey Wrench Award for his overt effort to sabotage the peace process.
I am also wary of the term national interest because it's often misused, and often it's obviously elites using it in order to mobilize public for interests that are not for the common man. But in this case, in fact, the national interest as espoused by Obama does in fact correspond with national interest. So that's why in this case I'm not reluctant to use it. And people who then want war are clearly not in national interest. But the final agreement is clear. Iran will have a nuclear program, but not a nuclear weapons program. Okay? So what's Israel going to say? That Iran can't even have a nuclear program? The U.S. president agrees with Iran having a nuclear program.
Of course, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say that they have the capacity to have a nuclear weapon in a month or 2 months, and that we can't trust them, and that we can't have this agreement because it's going to, it's not in the interests of Israel, and then it's not in the interests of the United States. We all know the arguments, what they're going to give.
Yeah. Well,
The question is, can we counter these arguments, and can we build a mass movement that's going to make sure that we know the distinction between what the interim agreement and their arguments that are going to be on the final.
Well, the final agreement won't be like that Iran will have the capacity in 1 month or 2 months.
Well,
It will have a theoretical capacity in the long term, maybe in 10 years to do it. And if that's acceptable to the U.S. Administration, what's Israel going to do about it? Okay, the U.S. can say, well, Israel doesn't like it, you can go and attack Iran. Don't count on us.
Yesterday there was a conference call, and it was co-convened by Rusty, as a matter of fact. There was a good deal of attention in that conference call to the Helsinki meeting that was postponed on the issue of a nuclear weapons-free, in fact, a weapons of mass destruction-free Middle East. I'm wondering how you feel about pushing that at this time. Would it be useful? Would it get in the way? And I have a kind of a follow-up question about whether the real issue here is a nuclear-free Middle East in both energy and weapons terms, because any kind of nuclear energy is the opening and cover for possible weaponization. You might even talk about the status of other nations in the Middle East with regard to both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons.
Well, the case has been made in Iran long before this, actually, Islamic Republic under the Shah, that Iran needed nuclear energy, and that eventually oil is going to run out, and therefore it needs an alternative. I don't know, I don't buy that argument because I'm not really in favor of nuclear energy, but the fact is plenty of scientists and energy experts would say this is a feasible alternative. I think the dangers of nuclear energy and the costs are actually too much for it. But that I can't say that you can get a consensus from scientists on that agreement. So any government in Iran could argue that nuclear energy is worth pursuing because eventually you're going to have an alternative to oil. So that's an open-ended argument, and the regime, of course, uses that. But I think the real reason for their nuclear program is, of course, this question of deterrence and capability of being able to build a bomb in the final analysis. And then there's another reason, I think, which is in the West is probably underestimated, is a question of prestige. Third world countries, of course, are very concerned about catching up with the West in terms of technology. And for ill or good, nuclear technology has been seen throughout the world as a cutting edge of science. So if you can get to there, then you're seen as having caught up with Western countries. Again, I don't buy that, but that's, I think, a universal basically tendency you find not just in Iran, in third world countries, that if you can develop nuclear technology, you have become a developed modern country. And it's hard to argue against that.
Can you talk about the Helsinki conference and whether you feel a push towards revival of Helsinki it would be useful here, or whether it would just cloud the issue of these other negotiations?
I think anything else that's brought in will cloud it, because this is basically U.S.-Iran deal negotiations, and the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the more problems you're going to have. You saw that with P501. The French have had their own private interests. They threw into the spanners into the work. So, in fact, it would be better if Europe wasn't so much involved. It was purely U.S. and Iran negotiating.
No, I don't think that there's an all-purpose answer to your question, Bob. I think that it sort of depends on what you're doing. What your forum is. I mean, it is the position of Brooklyn for Peace that there should be a nuclear-free Middle East. So that's not, we're on record is that, and depending on what the setting is, what we're actually doing, what the activity is, that the contradiction of saying nothing about the Israeli arsenal and focusing on the potential of Iran, it's certainly something that can come up, but it really just depends on, on the particular form that we're using at a given moment. I wouldn't, for example, if I were in a meeting which I wasn't, with Gillibrand's staff, I would certainly, and I think people probably did say this is a contradiction and bring it up. But there are also just so many other things that are so outrageous about the position that these senators are taking that I think it's also, it's their mistake. And so we should move in and really clarify how outrageous it really is, both in our conversations with them, but more importantly, again, with our effort, our outreach to our wider community.
And that's the role of Saudi Arabia, which seems, I want to ask in general what role Saudi Arabia is playing at this point in the actual negotiations and their seemingly strange relationship with Israel, as well as whether they're present in Congress and lobbying on this issue. So,
I don't know the answer to that certain question. Jeff, you want to talk about?
The Saudi policy is always sort of nicknamed and shrouded in mystery and so on. Mainly because there is no one policy maker. There are a number of people in Saudi Arabia make policy, sometimes at a tangent. But in the last 2 years, the Saudis have become much more assertive. Before they were much more basically enclosed, interested in their home territory. But they've suddenly got interested in Egypt, Libya, Syria, and so on. So they're trying to use their money to exert their influence. The question again is, how much should U.S. policy be determined by U.S. interests or the Saudi interests? Again, if Saudis feel that they should go to war to Iran, well, they're welcome to it. why should U.S. be involved in that? And the Saudi actually policy in some ways is highly dangerous for the United States. And again, Obama administration is trying to distance itself from the Saudis. The Saudi ideology is very inflammatory and actually genocidal. Wahhabi preachers basically openly call for the extermination of Shias, Alavis. And the last thing the U.S. administration wants to do is get involved with such a policy. So if the Saudis want to encourage such a sort of sectarian warfare, it's basically should be their business. U.S. should distance itself from Saudi Arabia. And I think, again, looking at, again, Obama's administration, they're not only trying to withdraw from Afghanistan and the Gulf, they're actually trying to have long-term policy where their U.S. footprint in the Gulf is much less, which means their U.S. protection of Saudi Arabia will be much less. They're basically being told that don't depend on the United States for a blank check policy. This is, I think, where you have to go to the premise, the false premises of the argument about sanctions. When they say we should increase sanctions, what they're saying is sanctions have worked. They've forced Iran to come to the table. So if we continue with the sanctions, they'll even be more willing to negotiate. That's
So we
based
said
on,
we wouldn't increase the sanctions. That was clearly stated in the agreements.
but you have to go even further. It's not the sanctions that have led Iran to the negotiation table. They were willing to negotiate 10 years ago. Sanctions have nothing to do with the negotiations.
For the last 30 years, there's been one article after another about how close Iran is to having a nuclear weapon. 3 years, 2 years, 7 years, 10 years, and it repeats it. Sometimes it comes from Israel, sometimes it comes from the United States. And it's never happened. And I think giving the ground that they want to position themselves 2 steps away from having a nuclear weapon gives ground to the right wing, who wants to argue exactly that. That if we let them get away with, if we release the sanctions, then they'll just be 2 steps away from a nuclear weapon, and then we've given them the nuclear weapon. And I think it's a very, I don't think it's true. You know, at this point, I believe that they want nuclear power. And it is Netanyahu's position they want to bomb, and we don't have to believe him.
Now, I mean, if you look at the Israeli administration, they say, if you go back 10 years, they say in 10 months Iran will have a nuclear weapon. 10 months, they say, oh, in the next 10 months. The fact is that if you look at CIA reports, and not just the CIA, because people put their very reliance on CIA, but 16 other U.S. intelligence agencies, they all have concluded that Iran has no weapons program. And they have now made the decision to go with weapons. So
when you say that they want to position themselves to be close enough to develop deterrence if they need it, they're not even beginning that. If they don't have a nuclear weapons program, then they're not even close to that.
yeah, but they're thinking in long terms.
Why is the left press so silent on this S-1881? And what can we do to turn that around? Because I do think it's very important that we do so.
You know, if I can just come for a second, I actually think that there's been more of the, and maybe Jim Loeb in the article that there is in Common Dreams today was talking about this. I actually think in the establishment press there's been more than one would imagine, and I think both the Washington Post and the New York Times have come out very clearly, you know, saying this is a good process and it should be encouraged, and S-1881 should be defeated. And you're hearing that actually a lot in the media. In some ways it's been a little bit more silent, you know, in the left media, but not totally. I mean, yesterday, the conference call that Teddy was alluding to, which was actually almost unmanageable, that was a call for groups around the country, you know, who are concerned about this issue, and we even gave the wrong number, so you think no one would get on this call. And there were like 100 people on that call from all over the country last night. And that was pretty, that really, from literally all over. And it was pretty, we were actually kind of astonished. And it was very difficult actually to handle it because there were so many people on the call. But I think it is a sign, that there is interest. We still, still, we could do a lot more. And we can do a lot more here in Brooklyn. But I do really want to emphasize, yes, I think there's a huge fight. I think Ted's right that it's going to be a hard fight. I don't think it's clear how this will ultimately come out. But I also do feel very strongly, and I've said it's the risk of being repetitious, that I think it's really a fight worth making. But I also think it's a fight that in the course of doing it, we need to really broaden it so that we actually can, include in that discussion, what our elected officials are doing with respect to the whole spectrum of issues in the Middle East, notably Israel, Palestine, as well as Iran. I really think this is a great moment to really start pushing back. So I'm hopeful that I was astonished at the interest around the country actually last night, but hopeful that something positive can really grow out of this.
دامن کشان ساقی میخوارم از کنار یارم از تو گیسو افشان میگریزم بر جان می از شرنگ دوری بر غم مهجوری چون شرابی جوشان میبریزم نگران ساقی میخوارم از کنار یارم از تو گیسو افشان میگریزم